Good evening. My name is Jorge Jaime. I'm with CIGI. Let me welcome you to this institution. The subject for this evening is a small one, Canada and the challenges of globalization. Canada, of course, is gearing up for the G20 meeting that will be held in Toronto this June. And therefore, this topic is particularly apposite. As you may know, the G20, which has been described as the steering committee of the world economy, is something with which CIGI is very closely identified. For 4 years, CIGI advocated very strongly the establishment of such a group at leaders' level, an effort that was often dismissed as totally unviable and utopian. Some people even compared it to the possibility of reforming the UN Security Council. Well, suddenly, in November of 2008, a meeting of such a group was called for. It happened. So after 4 years of strong advocacy, books, conferences, working papers, it happened. And after that, a second meeting of the G20 was held in London in April of last year, and the third in September in Pittsburgh. As I said, the next will be held in Toronto on 26, 27 June, and a fourth in Seoul, South Korea in November. Even The Economist, as I was mentioning to Professor Clarkson earlier, that is generally very skeptical of summits of any sort, has come around to the notion that it is a good idea and said that the best thing to come out of the so-called Great Recession of 2008, 2009 was the creation of the G20 at leaders level. This is what public policy think tanks are for, to put ideas on the table and advocate for their implementation. Needless to say, we are therefore rather gratified that this has actually happened. There's little doubt that it was the global financial crisis that triggered the establishment of the G20. But I would argue that without the intellectual scaffolding and policy advocacy that was in place before it, it is difficult to imagine that it would have come into being out of the blue, as it were. We are therefore very lucky to have two distinguished scholars here with us to examine the broader issue of Canada and globalization. They have just published a book, Perilous Imbalance, How Canada Should Respond to Globalization's Inequities, published by UBC Press. As you might have seen, the books are there. They can even be signed by the authors. And there's a very interesting offer of a paperback that will only be available for other Canadians as of August. So you will get a real first cut at it. One could argue that Stephen Clarkson needs no introduction before any Canadian audience, but I will introduce him anyway. A fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, Dr. Clarkson is Professor of Political Economy at U of T and a Senior Fellow here at CIGI. One of Canada's leading political scientists, he has a very long list of publications to his record, dealing with a wide variety of issues. But in the course of the past few years, he has been especially interested in the political economy of North America, having published several books on the subject, of which the latest, previous to this one, is one provocatively entitled, Does North America Exist? Governing the Continent After NAFTA and 9/11. Dr. Stepan Wood is Associate Professor at Osgood Hall Law School and a member of the Executive Board of the Institute for Research and Innovation in Sustainability at York University. A member of the New York Bar, where he has practiced law, he has also written about environmental law and climate law. With you, Dr. Stepan Wood.
Thank you very much. My name's Stepan Wood. I'm not as young as I look, trust me. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you to all of you for coming. It's wonderful to see so many people out to hear a talk by a couple of academics about Canada's place in the world and the world's place in Canada. So we've written this book. The book is about globalization, and it's about the implications of globalization for Canadian law and governance. And I think, as all of you would agree, globalization has been a mixed bag for Canada and for Canadians. On the upside, we can point to the increasing variety of consumer goods available at low prices from all around the world, the increasing ease of international telecommunications, international travel, the increasing awareness of developments almost on an instantaneous basis as they emerge around the world. On the other hand, we have global terrorism, we have H1N1 flu, we had SARS, which almost put an end to Toronto's tourism economy for a few years. We have feelings of sort of cultural homogenization around Hollywood norms, and global climate change, other global environmental phenomena. Since we're here at CG, we thought it was important to say right at the outset that globalization really is all about governance innovation. Globalization has ushered in a series of innovative forms of governance, both at the global and regional and even subnational levels that we didn't experience before, say 25 years ago. And also, governance innovation will be essential, in our view, to addressing and redressing the imbalances that we see in our current experiences of globalization. So, by the end of this evening, we hope to have convinced you of two claims, or at least prompted a lively debate. The first is the proposition of imbalance, and the second is opportunity. Imbalance, the basic claim throughout our book, is that Canada's experience of globalization, the implications of globalization for law and governance as experienced by Canadians, are severely imbalanced, where there is, on the one hand, advantage or privilege to markets, to transnational capital, and to wealth, and on the other hand, a relative disadvantage or marginalization to people, to the environment, and culture, to put it to oversimplify to a certain extent. The second claim that we want to convince you of is that there is opportunity in the current situation. It's easy as Canadians to think about our experience of globalization as passive objects of external forces, and certainly much of Canadian history is about how external forces have shaped our lives and our prospects. But another fundamental point in our argument is that Canadians, as individuals, as companies, and also Canada as a state, have been agents in their own right. They've been agents in shaping our experience of globalization. They've been agents in shaping international institutions. And we have also been and can be agents in shaping alternatives. So the crucial question for us is whether and how we as Canadians can use our agency to ameliorate rather than exacerbate the imbalances that we're about to describe. So we suggest that imbalances can be found at all levels or in all arenas of governance. And for simplicity's sake, in the book and tonight, we will present our argument in the context of three, shall we call them, governance arenas. First of all, the arena of interstate relations. Secondly, the arena of the nation state, in particular, the transformations of the Canadian state under conditions of globalization. And finally, the arena of governance beyond the state, governance by and for business and civil society actors. I'm now going to turn over the podium to Professor Clarkson, who will talk about the interstate arena, and in particular, our argument that we have seen the emergence of institutions and rules at the international level that have the effect of really reconstitutionalizing the Canadian legal and political order. And by this, we are talking about the institutions and norms of economic globalization, in particular of the World Trade Organization and the North American Free Trade Agreement. And I will turn over the podium now to Stephen to continue that conversation. After a little while, he will deign to allow me to stand again and speak about the two other arenas I described. And then I'll sit down and he will get up one more time to talk about where do we go from here. So it's a very sort of democratic and egalitarian approach.
I'd like to just thank, to start with, CG and the Canadian International Council for setting up this chance for us to talk with you. We all know about the joy of sex. Some of us know about the joy of publishing. Both require consenting adults. And the difference between teaching university courses when students have to read what you give them to read, and publishing a book and talking to citizens who don't have to read, but are interested in ideas and may actually like buying a book and reading it, but in any case come to discuss important ideas of the times or of the past is a terrific reality. And to be able to, not just to publish a book, but then go around and talk to people who are interested in it is a real joy. And I wanted to thank the CIC and CG for making this possible. As Stepan said, my challenge is to convince you that there is an imbalance, and it is perilous, in global governance. And I'll try to do it by covering, and I think I've probably got 13 minutes left for my little section, what we cover in the first 5 chapters of the book, namely the argument that Canada does have, like other countries, an external constitution which both empowers it abroad or empowers its companies abroad and limits it at home. Next month, actually not next month, in May, I'm going to be giving lectures, one in Berlin and one in Helsinki. And there would be I wouldn't have any trouble convincing colleagues and citizens in Germany or Finland that they have an external constitution, because everybody knows that the European Commission in Brussels issues directives which the member states have to implement. Everyone knows that the European Court of Justice makes rulings which have direct effect in the member states of Europe. So even though they don't have a formal constitution which is spelled out as such yet, there's no question that in practice they have something which smells like a constitution, feels like a constitution, and is in effect a supranational constitution for the member states of the European Union. For us in North America, it's a harder sell to convince people that with NAFTA and the WTO, it's certainly much less comprehensive, much less balanced. It's an imbalanced constitution, but nevertheless, we do have we are part of a governance regime which has very direct consequences which we call perilous in the title of the book, because it is biased so heavily towards economic, investment, trade norms, and therefore biased against human rights, labor, environmental issues. And that creates a situation which we have got used to, and we as the public have tended not to be concerned about in the last decade since Osama bin Laden took over the news, and terrorism and narcotics and the global financial crisis have diverted our attention from an issue which started in the 1990s, and still remains a very, in our view, an extremely dangerous situation which does need to be rebalanced. What is the evidence? Well, let me talk briefly about the environment, about health, about cultural policy to make the case very briefly, and then Stepan will take over again. Take health. Thanks to Chapter 11 of NAFTA, which gives Mexican, and there aren't really any significance, but in principle, Mexican, but especially American companies in Canada, the right to challenge government measures which they deem not damaging to their bottom line. The government of Canada in the in the late 90s passed a regulation to prevent the trade of MMT, which is a chemical to enhance the octane level of gasoline and make car motors work more powerfully. The trade in the substance was banned because MMT was thought to be a neurotoxin. The company that made it in the States, Ethel Corporation, started a Chapter 11 case against Ottawa, and Ottawa caved in before the arbitration was finished and made an apology, admitted that it didn't have enough scientific evidence, even though the US EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, had banned MMT in the States. And so the Canadian public was left with no alternative but to inhale MMT in their gasoline until it was taken off the market for other reasons. But it's an example of how the economic constitution overrode health concerns as applied by regulation issued by Ottawa. I was going to talk about a global health issue, and that would related to the external constitution. And if one thinks of intellectual property rights, whether in NAFTA or the World Trade Organization's TRIPS agreements, that's the trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights, one comes very quickly to the question of drugs. That's not narcotics, but medical drugs. And the intellectual property rights in our external constitution are very powerful, favoring the branded drug industry and making it very difficult, not totally impossible, but difficult for cheaper generic versions of these drugs to be manufactured and sold in countries that are members of these agreements, which is pretty well every country. The big health issue that took on quite scandalous proportions was the problem of the HIV/AIDS pandemic in Africa, which, as you will know as well as we do from having heard Stephen Lewis speak or James Orbinski, is a huge, well, it is a pandemic, millions dying, and the scandal was that the price charged for the antiretroviral drugs necessary to treat those with HIV/AIDS was so high, thanks to the rights that the drug companies had to control their own pricing for these drugs, that they were simply beyond the reach of almost all Africans. The solution, which was to allow generic production of these drugs, was virtually impossible. We could, in the discussion period, we can go into the details if you want, but it's an example of how the global economic constitution has very serious, perilous effects on health. So on health, our argument is that this has to be taken seriously. On the environment, there was a similar case in Chapter 11 of NAFTA, gave an American company called S.D. Myers the chance to start a case against the Canadian government for having prohibited the cross-border trade of PCBs. PCBs are a toxic chemical used in electric transformers, and when they wear out, they have to be disposed of. The regulation forbade the sending these PCBs across the border. And S.D. Myers, which had a treatment plant in the States, started a case against the Canadian government, 5 minutes, for damages. And they won, even though Canada, in forbidding the cross-border trade of PCBs, was complying with the multilateral Basel Convention, which specifically forbade those countries that signed the convention from exporting dangerous chemicals. So once again, it was a conflict that you can see between the economic constitution, which in this case, the arbitration panel simply overrode that consideration and said that the NAFTA norms made it illegal for Canada to have passed that regulation. So that's another domestic example on the health side. Internationally, on the environment side, internationally, I could just say the 5-letter word Kyoto to make the point that whereas with the economic constitution, when a country signs on, it is bound. And the PCB example is a powerful one, where we were not allowed to comply with our international obligations because NAFTA prevailed over in that issue of PCBs. With Kyoto, and I can make this as a non-partisan statement, we had Prime Minister Chrétien, who signed on to Kyoto with a whim, more or less, because Bill Clinton was doing it. He would do it, but 1% more. He would make a 1% higher commitment for reducing Canada's greenhouse gas emissions by the year 2012. Mr. Martin, who succeeded him, his best friend, as we all know, proceeded to do nothing about it, pretty well. And Mr. Harper has actually then made it very clear that Canada, while staying in Kyoto, was not going to be obliged to respect its commitment. So here one has another environmental example of how the one set of rules, the economic rules, oblige members, whereas making a commitment on the environment sounds good, but it doesn't actually lead to the government being obliged to comply with what it has committed itself to. I was going to make one more point. What was the health culture? The magazine company Time Warner wanted to start a split-run edition of its magazine Sports Illustrated in Canada, which violated the Canadian magazine policy of keeping split-run magazines out of the magazine market because they used American editorial content and spliced in Canadian advertising, which would undermine the Canadian magazine industry's basic economy. Canada made, actually with Sheila Copps at the time, the government passed a regulation that advertising in split-run magazines would be taxed an extra 85%. And that was thought to be safe from a trade issue because this advertising was a service. And Canada hadn't committed itself to advertising under the GATS, the General Agreement on Trade and Services. That was our best advice coming from the legal Department of Foreign Affairs. The United States took Canada to court, as it were, in Geneva, and argued that this wasn't an issue about advertising, this was an issue about trade in goods. And magazines were goods, and there was no, in fact, there was no difference between Sports Illustrated on the one hand and Maclean's magazine on the other. They were, what was the phrase? Like products, yeah. And so, and Canada not just lost on that issue, but the WTO ruling ruled as illegal policies that had been put in place 30 or 40 years before, such as the postal subsidy, which gave Canadian magazines a subsidy on their postal expenses. So this is another example. I wouldn't argue that it imperils the world. It's not going to create an environmental disaster, but it's another example of how imbalanced our Constitution is externally if an economic value of trade can overwhelm a cultural value of preserving and protecting, promoting a national culture. So that's my part of the session, is to make the case that we do in fact have an external constitution, and it is imbalanced, and in some respects, certainly in the environment, it's perilously imbalanced. Now to my colleague.
So that's the interstate arena. There are two other arenas in which we examine Canada's experience of globalization. The arena of the nation state itself, and then the arena of sort of governance beyond the state. Certainly the supraconstitution that Stephen was talking about has implications for the Canadian state and has effected a transformation of the Canadian state. And I want now to elaborate more directly on what globalization has meant for Canada as a nation state. So it's our view that the current phase of globalization, the last 25 years or so in which the term globalization has come into currency, that current phase is inseparable from the global spread of a distinct set of ideas about the function of the state in relation to market and society. These ideas include the idea that a smaller government is a better government. It includes prescriptions for cutting programs and budgets, balancing budgets, fiscal responsibility, a step away from state intervention in the economy and society, and a belief that markets are, in general, better positioned to allocate goods and provide for welfare. It also takes the form of ideas about how to run government, the application of disciplines and techniques of business management to public management, a client service orientation, a results orientation in government, and so on. I could go on, but the important point is that we saw the global spread of these ideas from bases in the United States and in Britain, and partly in Western Europe, and then their embrace and sort of localization in countries around the world. And it was not a partisan political thing, and it remains that it is not, it doesn't break down sharply along partisan political lines. The first government to introduce aspects of this new sort of ideological consensus into Ontario was Bob Rae's NDP government, which shut down 2 of 3 drinking water testing labs and allowed for privatization of testing of drinking water, which was one of the first steps that ultimately ended up in the Walkerton tainted water disaster. And we saw in the 1990s governments of social democratic political parties, from New Labour in Britain to the Clinton Democrats and the Chrétien Liberals, take up the same set of ideas with differences here and there, and then of course the conservative governments at the provincial level of Mike Harris, Ralph Klein, and more recently in Ottawa. So it is an agenda or an ideological consensus that has been embraced by governments across all political stripes. Secondly, this has been accompanied by a transformation of the role of government which has been paradoxical. Paradoxical in the sense that it combines the well-known and well-publicized retreat of government from the provision of public goods or from commanding heights of the economy, but also its very muscular reassertion in other areas. And one of the great paradoxes of the last 20 years is that deregulation has often spawned even greater volume of regulations and larger number of regulatory agencies than existed before. So it's rather paradoxical. And, as we argue, it's imbalanced. And I'll just give you a taste of our argument in that connection. So, in terms of imbalance, you can contrast the cuts that were experienced by environmental ministries and programs across the country, federal and provincial, in the 1990s, with the muscular reassertion and the massive resources devoted to other areas, especially since 2001. The increased emphasis on state control of borders, so border security, immigration and refugee controls, projection of Canadian military might, and massive diversion of resources to defense spending that went along with it. So that's just one sort of blatant contrast. There are other more subtle developments around the same period. So one is the embrace by both provincial and federal governments of something called smart regulation or responsive regulation. Under the federal Martin government, there was a smart regulation initiative, which was continued under another name by the conservative government, the main thrust of which was to increase harmonization of Canadian health and safety regulations with American regulations, and to substantially speed up regulatory approval processes, which then invited criticism from environmental and labor groups saying that the initiative was anything but smart from an environmental perspective. Another thing that we've seen that has also is kind of paradoxical or ambiguous is the vast increase of networked, let me start that again. More and more of the work that was formerly done through international diplomacy at the state-to-state level is being done by networks of government officials working cross-border with each other. This has involved, on the one hand, an empowerment of provinces and provincial agencies, even mayors of cities, like David Miller as the chair of the C40 group of largest cities. But on the other hand, has also been accompanied by a general shunting away of this work into obscure and non-transparent processes. And the final point I would make on this front, in terms of imbalances in the sort of transformation of the Canadian state, is the persistent lack of remedies for Canadians or foreigners who are subjected to abuses, either human rights abuses by corporations or torture or other human rights abuses by state officials in other countries. So essentially the Canadian court's refusal to entertain lawsuits brought in Canada, for instance, for a Guyanese mine tailings dam collapse, which the action in Canada against the Canadian company involved was dismissed. Meher Arar's efforts to bring American officials to justice in Canada have not succeeded. Similarly, a case called Buzari, in which efforts to bring Iranian officials to justice in Canada for torture committed there not to mention situations like the Talisman case in the Sudan. In all of this, Canada and Canadians have been both exporters and importers, shall we say, have both been objects and agents. And on the side of exports, I mean, certainly Canada is proud of the Charter of Rights and Charter jurisprudence, and also our system of socialized medicine as models to be emulated abroad. And certainly Charter jurisprudence is very influential abroad in other countries undergoing contemporary exercises in constitutional entrenchment of human rights. But ironically, Canadian governments at the same time have championed governance reforms in Africa and other developing nations which bring along with them the same sort of recipes of small government, protection for private property rights, and private provision of public services, even to the extent of supporting initiatives abroad that would never fly back home in Canada, like a rather embarrassing situation of supporting user fees for healthcare in Tanzania long after even the World Bank had abandoned support or reconsidered support for that idea. On the other hand, Canada is probably more of an importer of new forms and norms of governance than an exporter. So I think we stand more, especially in the last 20 years, more as an importer of governance innovations than as a governance innovator ourselves. Perhaps with the exception, well, with a couple of exceptions Stephen will talk about, and in the area of Indigenous rights, our comprehensive land claims agreement process, which has paved the way for modern-day treaties between Canada and First Nations. So that's all I want to say about the arena of the Canadian state. Now, you couldn't talk about what globalization means without talking about business and civil society as governance actors in their own right. And so what I'm talking about here is the massive proliferation of governance initiatives of various kinds by business actors and by civil society. So anti-sweatshop campaigns, sustainable forestry standards, and the list could go on and on. And also beyond that, the emergence of collaborative governance initiatives that involve actors from business, from civil society, and often from government in sort of trilateral cooperative arrangements. And yet here too, we see the same theme of imbalance. So the first imbalance I want to talk about briefly is in the field of business governance. So on the one hand, we see that there's a sort of a variety of globalization from above, where large multinational corporations and international trade associations develop governance codes, voluntary codes of conduct, standards, etc., for the conduct of global business. And these, many of them have had substantial impact on business conduct. They can have substantial sort of force being pushed through the supply chain by companies to their suppliers. So Walmart, Nike, those sorts of things. And these forms of governance have been welcomed by governments and intergovernmental organizations with open arms. The irony here is that whereas we see increasingly that transnational corporations have enforceable legal rights on the international plane, they have legal personality, they are subjects of international law for the purpose of enjoying and asserting investor protection rights under bilateral investment treaties and NAFTA or other regional treaties. And yet, where are the corresponding legally binding obligations? They are not to be found. And as recently as 2008, John Ruggie, the United Nations Secretary General's special representative on business and human rights, issued a report which really said clearly and simply that corporations do not bear direct responsibilities to protect human rights in the international sphere. Those legal obligations are borne by states. What corporations have is a duty to respect, a duty to essentially exercise due diligence to ensure that their operations don't result in or permit human rights abuses to occur. But how's that duty to be operationalized? Professor Ruggie, although this question is still open, has signaled that he's more interested in voluntary, non-governmental approaches than hard international treaties. When you turn to civil society, a sort of this upwelling of globalization from below that we've seen ever since, well, especially the Seattle protests in 1999. There have been some successes, but still largely it's operating at the margins. So the World Social Forum, how much effect does the World Social Forum have on our lives as compared to the World Economic Forum in Davos each year? We would suggest much less. Another example of marginalization, there's a long-established organization in Canada, Kairos, the Canadian Ecumenical Justice Initiative, which for many years has a long history of responsible involvement in human rights and corporate social responsibility issues around the world. They originated a code of conduct called the Benchmarks Principles for Corporate Social Responsibility, which has then went global. It's now headquartered in South Africa, and it's seen by many as the gold standard for corporate social responsibility. And yet it has almost no companies willing to adhere to it. And most recently, as we know, Kairos has been defunded by the federal government for its alleged anti-Semitism in connection with its activities with an established Israeli human rights organization. So Canadians do have some agency in this field. In terms of Canadian business, how am I doing for time? Okay, great. In terms of Canadian business, it was the Canadian chemical industry that launched an initiative known as Responsible Care. This was in the aftermath of the Bhopal disaster at the Union Carbide plant in Bhopal, explosion that killed thousands of people. And the Canadian industry came out with this code of responsible environmental management for its own members, partly to distance themselves from their American counterparts, and partly to forestall the threat of stringent regulation as, the reaction to Bhopal. That originally Canadian initiative is now a global initiative that is essentially a requirement for membership in the chemical industry associations in dozens of countries around the world. And it has evolved from a very sort of loose and voluntary system to a system that includes fairly robust community involvement and independent verification. That is, as I said, a requirement for membership in chemical company associations around the world. But aside from, there's a few examples you can point to, but aside from that, largely Canadian business have been importers or receivers of these global governance initiatives, responding to demands from corporate headquarters abroad or responding to the demands of customers elsewhere. And a similar story with civil society. We can point to some great examples. Stephen will give some examples of civil society agency on the part of Canadians. I would mention Greenpeace, established in Vancouver in 1970. But there aren't as many as we would like to see. Now, that wraps up what I had to say on the subject of governance beyond the state. And just to wrap up this segment of the talk before turning to, where can we go from here? I just want to emphasize the seriousness of the situation as we see it. These imbalances are not just sort of theoretical or on the books. In our view, we are facing serious, real imbalances that take the form of fundamental crises or that are expressed in fundamental crises. So on the one hand, the unfolding environmental crisis symbolized most poignantly by climate change, and on the other hand, the global economic and financial crisis of 2008-9, from which apparently we are now recovering. And in both cases, we would suggest that these crises demand a fundamental transformation of governance, a transformation in the patterns of production and consumption in our societies. And really, governments of the world have not grasped this opportunity that these crises represent to fundamentally rethink how we govern and are governed. And yet, I mean, really, the time is ripe. Whether it's the Liberal Party's Thinkers Conference last weekend, the issue of Afghan detainee abuse, the issue of the economic stimulus, or the issue of wearing of the niqab, millions of Canadians are talking about Canada's place in the world and the world's place in Canada, and the time is really ripe for a conversation about what we as Canadians can do. And I'll turn it over to Stephen to speculate on what that might be.
I think you can get a sense of why it's been such a pleasure to work with Stepan over these last 5 years in getting our thoughts together and then getting them actually into print, because he's a very careful and systematic and scrupulous scholar at Osgood, and so it's been a great learning experience for me, and I want to express my gratitude, even if he's a harsh timekeeper.
The feeling is mutual.
So my job is now to talk about should the imbalance be rebalanced. But I think I should start by making it clear that I understand that there are many, many who do not agree with our analysis. There are many who don't think there is a problem. There are many who do think that the external constitution is a good thing for the world and for Canada. Just think, for instance, and you will remember, it's wonderful to be with an audience to whom I can say, you will remember Peter Lougheed. And the Premier of Alberta was delighted with the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement because it meant that there could be no, as he put it, son of the NEP. There could be no repetition of the Pierre Trudeau's assault on Alberta sovereignty that took the form of the National Energy Program. And the Globe and Mail is still calling for more free trade agreements to be signed, and negotiated and signed. And indeed, if you could imagine that there was an Academy Awards in trade policy, in the trade policy field, I think Canada would undoubtedly get the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor, as with the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement, with NAFTA, with the WTO, and now with its own bilateral agreements, now finished apparently with Colombia and other countries. There still are those who believe not just that the external constitution is good, but it needs to be strengthened and extended. And for those who love it, obviously the way forward is to do more. But the question then is, for those who agree with our analysis, those who they don't disagree with having strong global governance, they disagree with having strong imbalanced global governance. The question becomes what to do, what can be done. And I wanted to give you two examples of what has been done to start with, and then finish up. And what has been done by civil society, by NGOs, non-government organizations, in one issue that I raised beforehand, the question of generic drugs and as opposed to the branded drugs, or rather the question of the price of drugs for the pandemic in Africa. I mentioned Stephen Lewis. I'd also mention in this regard James Orbinski, of whom you will all know, who when he was president of Médecins Sans Frontières, the MSF happened to get the Nobel Prize. But more important, since then, he has his own NGO called Dignitas, but he has been, with others, negotiating directly as an NGO, giving up really on governments getting the intellectual property rights regime fixed. And it must be 3 years ago he told me that they had negotiated down the price of treatment for a person for a year in Africa from $1,500 to $200 per person per year. Now $200 would also be beyond the reach of most Africans, but the point is that some rebalancing has taken place by citizens organized in one kind of group or another, acting directly and trying to make the change that governments aren't making. The other example is one of governments operating, and it deals with what I mentioned earlier about Canada losing the Sports Illustrated case and having its magazine policy undone by the judges in Geneva. The result of that was that a lawyer in Toronto called Peter Grant, of whom he may well have spoken here because he published a book on, what's it called? On sort of the global cultural industries. Peter suggested that what the world needed, having lost this decision to the external constitution, was another agreement, another international agreement that would balance against the WTO protecting culture. Sheila Copps comes up in the story again because at that point she was heritage minister. She liked the idea and she drove a process of international negotiation similar to what Lloyd Axworthy had done in the late 1990s, leading to the International Criminal Court and the treaty banning the use of anti-personnel landmines. Sheila Copps drove a international effort to build a global coalition of governments favoring this kind of, it wasn't, the terminology wasn't used, but in effect it was an anti-WTO instrument to protect national cultures. And they engaged NGOs in countries to lobby their governments, and quite quickly, by October of 2005, in Paris at UNESCO, the United Nations Education, Scientific and Cultural Organization, a convention was signed with the jazzy name, the Convention for the Protection and Promotion of the Diversity of Cultural Expression, which created a new legal norm empowering countries to protect their cultures against the kind of action that Canada had lost over Sports Illustrated. Now, we don't know whether it's going to be very effective or not, but it's definitely created a legal regime which countries can use in arguing that what they're doing is not trade protectionism, it's cultural protection, which needs to be supported. So those are just two examples of what has been done relatively recently in dealing with the perilous imbalance. So to sum up, what we're saying is that to contain the propensity of the unregulated market to self-destruct, or the unregulated market to worsen the problems of world health or worsen the crisis of the environment we're facing, that the global governance system needs to be rebalanced. And I think we've shown that it can be done. It's clear historically that, and I can't say you will remember 1945, but we know that at the end of World War II, the Allied powers restructured the world governance system. We know that Europe, after World War II, restructured itself and created this amazing experiment in transnational governance now called the European Union. So we know it has been done. We know that citizen groups are necessary to push governments, but we also know that while they're necessary, they're not sufficient, and that governments themselves have to be persuaded that they need to take the lead, or if not the lead, to respond to the pressure, to do the rebalancing we need, because certainly in the environmental domain, we are facing the possibility of the planet no longer being hospitable to human life. So the point is that this has been done in the past, and ladies and gentlemen, we are arguing that it has to happen in the future. Thanks very much. So can we just take questions? I don't know, can the lights be put on in a way that we can see everyone? Or there's a portable mic, and yeah, so.
So we convinced you, I see. That's great. Well, let's just start signing books. Ah, there's a question.
Would you mind giving your name, and please?
Sure. My name's Eric Saunders.
Can you be heard?
Just bring it right up.
Put it right up to your mouth.
Okay. Hi, my name's Eric Saunders. I'm a member of the Grand River chapter of Kairos. And so first of all, I'd like to thank you very much for your kind comments and your concern. My question for you is, who are the leaders now in civil society leading this anti-globalization movement?
Did you say who are the leaders now? What was the last part? Leading?
Leading the anti-globalization movement, or the push to rebalance.
Okay.
I'd like to, so there are people who consider themselves anti-globalization, but I think it's an unfortunate phrase because there are lots of positive things about globalization, and it may be the anti-economic globalization, but the internet, their communications possibilities, their migration possibilities, which are really positive in what's happening these days. Well, one leader that we all know about is Maud Barlow, and she, and if your question is who's leading globally as opposed to nationally, she has taken on a role globally in the struggle to declare and implement a right to water. The most obvious scandal was the privatization of water in Bolivia, particularly in Cochabamba, where apparently and it's mainly an indigenous population, the people were told all of a sudden that since a French company was now owned water, they would have to pay for the rain that they were collecting from their roofs. And that struggle has had some success, but she's one definite leader. I mean, we're Canadians, we know about the Canadian examples. There are examples in every country of citizens groups having a very substantial role, often with their governments, not necessarily against them, in trying to remediate the problems that have been caused, not all by transnational corporations, but in many cases.
I would just add that I sort of want to resist this sort of naming idea, because the solutions or the leaders are found both in the form of individuals, charismatic individuals who are sort of transnational norm entrepreneurs or moral entrepreneurs, but also at a mass level in terms of large numbers of people working together. I mean, the great thing about the World Social Forum, for instance, is its massive diversity and the large numbers of people who are just sort of working invisibly at the grassroots. And I did mention Kairos, but who knows, aside from the recent news coverage, how many people heard about what Kairos has done. And there are so many organizations and individuals who are working behind the scenes. And so I think that's as important as the other. As we're waiting, the other thing I would point out is we don't know who it's going to be in a few years from now. I mean, before Craig Kielburger set up his, is it Save the Children? Yeah. As a 13-year-old, I mean, he sort of just came out of nowhere, right, and turned into a global phenomenon in the course of a few years. Who knows who the next Craig Kielburger is going to be?
And there are a lot of teachers in this audience, or former teachers. It's quite amazing what students do now, partly thanks to the internet, but I have a student, for instance, who worked for a couple of years in a little magazine in Toronto, and then she went to South Africa. She didn't have any introductions. She didn't know anyone there. But soon she was working in Mandela's office, in the president's office in South Africa. And then Stephen Lewis picked her up to be his Africa assistant. And I had her talking to my students 3 years ago. She was spellbinding. I got hold of her 2 years ago to ask her back to my class, and she was actually in Geneva now working in the World Health Organization. So it's quite phenomenal how students, the new generation feel themselves completely mobile, feel connected, and can go virtually anywhere and try to do something of value. So it's really just echoing Stepan's point that we don't know, but leadership, there's certainly a lot of energy, but the interesting thing is how much negative energy there is in our elites who feel that this kind of energy is an attack on them, because I think the whole free trade, going back to the 80s in Canada, the free trade debate was very polarizing for us, partly in the way that Mr. Mulrooney set up the process, because he pretty well excluded all of civil society from the negotiating process, and necessarily the trade union movement, the environmental movement, the women's movement, Aboriginal groups, pensioners felt threatened as they were. And it's led to this black and white, we against them culture in Canada, which persists. So, but it's a shame, because a lot of citizen energy is very positive. It's not anti-globalization, it's trying to do something to fix what has happened.
Yes, I have another question. You have dealt largely with the question of sort of the free trade side of globalization debate versus, say, the cultural integrity aspect of it. But I would say there's another axis to this, which has to do with what we might call the dark side of globalization. Globalization has done many good things, as you've quite rightly pointed out, but there's also another side in terms of smuggling, drug trafficking, the white slave trade, many things that have been facilitated by terrorism, some would argue, by globalization. Now, that is something that has to be dealt with. There are some very negative consequences that emanate out of them. I would wonder if you might like to elaborate a bit on that, if within your framework, how do you approach that side of globalization?
Okay, well, I would like to respond. Sorry, did you want?
Please go ahead.
I'd like to respond in terms of North America as opposed to the world, because I've been working on North America, mainly Mexico, US, Canada. And I didn't want to bring it into today's talk, but there's an imbalance in North America, which is a little different from what we were talking about globally. And that is, we have NAFTA as more or less the only governance institution which is tri-national, embracing the whole of the continent. But it is very, very weak. We've emphasized Chapter 11 of NAFTA, which is strong, giving American corporations power in Canada to undo certain government regulations. But apart from that, the NAFTA institutions have no capacity to make decisions collectively for the three countries. There's no administrative capacity, there's no deliberative capacity, there's no executive capacity. So we have a rule book which favors investment and trade among the countries, but it has absolutely nothing to say about, and there's no way of dealing with, any of the consequences of trade acceleration. So whether it's drugs or the labor market or immigration or increased poverty or the worsening environment, we have in North America no way of coping with these issues. The specific issue of narcotics in North America is huge. Happily, Hillary Clinton last year in Mexico City acknowledged that the root causes of the narcotics problem in the United States is not the Mexican cartels, it's the demand for drugs by the American population, and it's the supply of firearms to gangs in Canada and cartels in Mexico of guns made in the United States. So there's been a slight shift forward. There's also been a move forward. I was just in Mexico this winter, and it's clear that your equivalents in the foreign ministry, for instance, are saying that since 1997, with the Merida initiative signed between Washington and Mexico City, there's been a big shift in the approach both of Washington and Mexico. Washington is now feeling much better about the government of Mexico, not about the cartels, but it's feeling much better about the government of Mexico because Calderon sent the army into Ciudad Juarez in an attempt to overcome the cartels. Now, he hasn't succeeded, but it was a declaration of intent by the Mexican government which made Washington feel much more confident and more trusting towards the Mexicans. Meanwhile, the Mexicans have had a big Mexican government, no, not Mexicans necessarily, the Mexican government has had a big shift in its attitude towards the narcotics issue. It used to feel that the whole thing was a gringo problem, that we wouldn't have the cartels if they didn't have the market demand for drugs. Now, however, the violence in the northern cities has taken on such ghastly proportions, such extreme proportions, that the Mexican government is now saying this is our security problem too. So they are now willing, for the first time, to accept aid from Uncle Sam. The gringo, the great threat from the north, is now becoming an ally in this. I shouldn't have gone on at such length, but it's to make the point that governance is sort of happening ad hoc because the problem has become so extreme that Washington is looking at it more realistically, and Mexico is changing its approach. But the fact remains that North America, all these things are being done on an ad hoc basis. Canada is pretty well absent from that conversation, even though Canada is the major supplier of ecstasy to the American market. And if you put the two together, Canada and Mexico together are the major suppliers of the five major major illegal drugs consumed in the American market. So Canada needs to be part of that, but isn't. Canadian gangs, for instance, do actual trading of high-quality marijuana for cocaine. And they barter, because if they don't sell to each other, they don't have a money laundering problem. But there's a tremendous integration of the illegal drug industry, and governments are handling it the way, well, there's this important shift that's happened, but nevertheless, it points out that we don't have a constitution for North America adequate to deal with such a crisis.
Other questions? There's two, one there and then one back to the left.
Good. Jim Walls. Just more a matter of clarification. If the thesis is that we want to dampen the sales of neoliberalism, do I understand you properly that we would look to a trade agreement restructuring the institutions of NAFTA, for example, as a way of dealing with these dark sides of globalization. That seems like a la Robert Pastor or somebody kind of looking more out of a trade agreement than we want to see.
I can, sure. I don't think it's as simple as that, and I have to admit that our prescriptive analysis is much less developed than our critical or diagnostic analysis. But I think there is something to be accomplished by tinkering with the international trade architecture. I was going to say earlier, I don't think either of us are anti-globalization. And speaking for myself, I'm not anti-globalization and I'm not anti-trade. I'm very much in favor of open trade that preserves space for diversity of national systems of capitalism. In fact, I think just to take a page from Tad Homer Dixon's book, resilience is what you need in a global system as well as in a national system. You can't have resilience with monocultures. And so a single approach to market, liberal democratic market economies isn't a good recipe for resilience. So there are some things that can be done in the context of these BITs and in the context of NAFTA. Not that either of us think that NAFTA is about to be reopened for negotiation. But, for instance, making clearer the ability of governments to regulate for legitimate public welfare objectives, and that such regulation would not constitute a violation of investor protections. And in fact, since 2003 or so, both the United States and the Canadian model BITs, or in the case of Canada, the FIPAs, contains such a clause, Bilateral Investment Treaty, BIT. Anyway, they contain such a clause, and the agreements negotiated by Canada since then, for instance, the Canada-Peru contains such a clause. But there's only so much you can do, of course, tinkering with the existing system, and we certainly don't suggest that it would be sufficient, which is why we have this rather nebulous suggestion that we need to be working on other fronts too. So I think we need to be working on a strengthening of global governance regimes devoted to the provision of global public goods, such as environmental protection, cultural diversity, cultural security, and so on. And also, we need to be encouraging or demanding that our governments facilitate rather than actively hinder the expressions of alternatives in civil society. So rather than clamping down on civil society expression and protest since APEC and since 2001, instead fostering a diversity of opinions, a diversity of expression, a diversity of sort of alternative experiments in governance. So it's not a very complete answer, I recognize.
I would add that in some respects the economic constitution does need to be changed, and even the U.S. Congress has come to this position. But the biggest example is this Chapter 11 of NAFTA, which gives foreign investors unusual powers that are greater than those of domestic corporations to attack government regulation. Congress has now told the administration, this was a few years ago already, that in future negotiations it is not to repeat that part of Chapter 11 which gives foreign companies greater rights in the United States than domestic companies. And so that's one aspect of the problem. Another is, and we go into this in great detail, largely from Stepan's work, the actual process, I don't know how many lawyers there are here, but the actual arbitration process is such a violation of what we think of as the norms of a good justice system. For instance, the arbitrators, there are 3 arbitrators in each of these cases, they aren't independent judges with tenure who can make their judgments without worrying about the consequences. They're arbitrators who have no conflict of interest rules, so they can be sitting on a case and also acting as a lawyer for the company in the case. There's a lot of secrecy, there's very little transparency. So the whole process is really a violation of our legal principles. And this kind of privatization and denationalization, taking an issue which is judging the validity of a democratically passed regulation somewhere else by people who may or may not know much about the country involved, in this case Canada, is really an aberration, and that can be corrected. The other kind of change is that other policy systems globally, like health or environment or culture, can be strengthened. So we're not against global governance, we're against unbalanced global governance. And it's terrific to have strong global governance if the rules are good. A way ahead would be to strengthen other aspects of global governance so they're more or less on a par with the economic constitution.
Just before we go to the question over there, one small clarification. In these arbitrations, it's not that an arbitrator would be counsel in the same case, but it is not at all uncommon for the same person to be sitting as an arbitrator in one case, counsel to the investor in another case, and advising governments in a third case. So, and the key point underneath, though, is that they rely on the repeat business. They must develop a set of interpretations that will generate repeat business. And if they are too friendly to the governments, the investors are not going to use the rules. So there's a sort of a structural bias in favor of investor interests. Use them.
Why don't the governments legalize drugs, but the governments control it, take the criminal element out of it?
Could you talk into the mic, please?
Yes, I can. I don't need it. Take the criminal element out of it, and tonight we're sitting in a palace that alcohol built.
Well, I agree with that position. I don't think it's going to solve every problem. The damage done to every economy by narcotics is huge. The health problems, the loss of work, the disruption of families, go on and on. Nevertheless, it's hard to detect trends, but a year ago, the former president of Mexico, de la Madrid, and two other, Jorge, you might remember who they were, two other former Latin American country presidents in a report argued
Cardozo.
Argued for legalization. And the argument is very powerful. At least it would mean that all that money that the drug cartels make would be now taxable, and some of that would go to paying for the medical damage caused by addiction. But the case, that position is strenuously resisted by the three federal governments. California is moving towards a very partial legalization, it seems, of marijuana use. And where Canada has made some hesitant steps forward, the United States has indicated very, very strong displeasure. You may remember the former ambassador Cholucci warned that Canadians would have longer waits at the border if small doses of marijuana were no longer made a criminal offense. So, but the issue is really on the agenda now. People know that 40 years of the war on drugs has failed to reduce the consumption of drugs and has only led to the increase of violence and these now global cartels.
I just want to continue this conversation because I think it's very interesting. The drug war has actually been taking place for over 90 years. Addiction problems for hard narcotics are really are affecting less than about 1 to 2% of our population. Marijuana is actually healthy for us. I wonder when we're going to stop letting the U.S. government dictate these laws to the Latin American countries as well as our own, because we could actually solve a lot of problems just by legalizing and regulating, taxing. I think we would find a huge solution globally, not just for the North American continent.
Well, I'll just take that as a comment, but it's not just the United States pushing all countries to do what it wants. Most governments take the same position. Sure, in good part, but we are also responsible for our own policies, and we choose to maintain prohibition. Yeah.
One of the biggest imbalances that exists, I think, is agricultural subsidies in North America and Europe, which when you're traveling in Africa and Latin America and you see the impact it has on farmers trying to grow legitimate crops as opposed to those various other kinds of crops. So there could be some aspect of that. That's a serious imbalance, and I'm curious as to how you see that being addressed. I'm curious about the role of the internet, because I know of farmers in Bolivia and in Latin America that have had access to the futures markets information and have been able to price their products more appropriately. And of course we have fair trade initiatives and things like that that are very creative methods for addressing some of these imbalances without having to worry about, you know, a lot of the political aspects and waiting for that machinery to work. But I see a real potential in the internet and access to information to align people. And of course then we have these tremendously unfair subsidies where farmers working in Burkina Faso for $1 a week can't compete with products coming in from Europe that go on their marketplaces. So that's a serious imbalance, and I'm wondering what your thoughts are about addressing that issue.
Well, thank you. You are going to cause me to contradict myself, because having said that the economic constitution is too strong, I'll now say it's too weak, because it does not cover that kind of subsidy. One of the moves forward from NAFTA to the WTO, and one of the triumphs of the WTO, was to have a subsidy code, but it didn't affect agriculture. The subsidy code was a new set of rules that clarified what subsidies governments could give their industry that were okay. Those are called green light subsidies, as opposed to red light subsidies, which were not okay. And you will remember that Brazil took, thanks to this rule, Brazil took Canada to court in Geneva for unfairly subsidizing the export of Bombardier's regional jet planes, because the technology partnership program in Ottawa in effect gave an export subsidy to Bombardier. Canada at the same time took Brazil to court in Geneva for its subsidizing of Embraer's regional jet aircraft in foreign markets. And it was a kind of standoff, because they're both middle powers and they both had the same issue, and they sort of settled out of court ultimately. But these subsidy rules do not prevent the United States from massively subsidizing its own farmers. And so I think you're absolutely right to make the distinction between free trade and fair trade, because the United States corn industry, after the fall of the Soviet Union, had lost a major market in Russia, and they were looking for a market for their corn. They very much wanted the Mexican market, and Washington prevailed over Mexico, which resisted but didn't manage to resist, prevailed on Mexico to bring the tariff on corn down to zero over a number of years. This has contributed to the devastation of the Mexican countryside, where that subsistence farming based on corn and the Mexican culinary culture of a corn-based cuisine was devastated, with 2 million, the figure 2 years ago that people were using was that 2 million campesinos had left their villages, left their villages for the cities, left their villages for the United States, leaving the pueblos just with grandparents and kids running around. So it's had a devastating effect on Mexico. And your point about agricultural subsidies not being controlled makes a case that we need that the economic constitution to be itself more balanced.
I would just add that another effect was a substantial reduction in the biodiversity of maize cultivated in Mexico as well, which you may already be aware of, which is a great loss to, again, resilience. And it's a really good point you bring up, because it's an example of imbalance, not between Canada and the United States. It's not one in which Canada is the poor, suffering, weaker party. It's an example of the massive imbalances which are even more perilous and more blatant between the global north and the global south. And that is a theme that we develop somewhat in the book, but it's sort of lost in the focus on Canada. And I don't think we would want to suggest that the imbalances that we experience as Canadians are somehow greater or more important than the imbalances we play an active part in perpetuating between the global north and the global south. Yeah, and by the way, there's another question up here also, halfway up.
Hi, Peter Kofler. I'd like to pick up on, you used some terms like resilience and monoculture and terms that have ecological implications. And I was wondering if I could pick up on that. A report was produced back in the 70s called Limits to Growth. I think it was produced under the auspices of the Club of Rome. And in it, they produced a model which predicted that we would hit the limits to growth, ecologically speaking, I guess, in the year around 2010. They've since rerun the model with revised, hardware and software, and they've come out with the same answer. I guess a model is not reality, but my question pertains to the seeming magical, strange absence of any talk of limits to growth in a lot of this talk of globalization and neoliberal market theory. It seems to be almost a sacred paradigm that cannot be touched. And I'm wondering if this is sort of embedded in your thoughts on revising global governance with respect to trade, whatever, all of the implications of globalization, or if you as well are simply ignoring it and trusting that at some point we're actually going to hit the limits catastrophically, and we'll have to deal with it in that way.
I didn't catch everything you said. I'm sorry. You could probably see I was straining to hear. But I wouldn't see hitting those limits like a brick wall as a good thing in any way. I'm not sure if that's what you were suggesting, but in the book we talk about certain sort of criteria or core values against which to judge globalization and globalized governance, and one of them is ecological sustainability. We don't attempt to specify that criterion. I'm not a modeler myself. I'm trained as a lawyer, not an economist or an ecologist. But I subscribe to the view very strongly of the ecological economists that the human economy is a wholly owned subsidiary of the global ecosystem. Even if I don't understand the models. I know about the Club of Rome, the limits to growth models, and the sort of the fact that they were rerun more recently. But even without understanding the math or the complex ecological theory, I sort of take it as a basic truth that human economy does need to exist within certain limits of the absorptive and adaptive capacity of the ecosystems that provide the sort of ecological goods and services on which the human economy depends. I have no way of knowing what those limits are or when we'll meet them, and that's why I also like, and I think Stephen and I have talked about this as well, we like the ideas of the tipping point, the notion that there may be a point of stress in ecosystems in which they tip and they shift to a different state. So, and the idea that these tipping points are essentially unpredictable, we may have already passed them. So in terms of I mean, it may be that they're right, 2010. Did you say 2010? Yeah, that may be the year. Maybe this is the year of the limits and we just don't know it. Apparently, have we passed peak oil now? Is that agreed that peak oil is already passed or at least upon us? But it may be that these things are all happening sort of simultaneously, and we'll only know in our grandchildren's time that was indeed the case. So, I mean, part of our argument is to guard against that possibility by urgent action now, even if we don't understand the models or the exact mechanisms. And I'm sorry if I didn't answer your question better, because I didn't hear crucial parts of it, I think.
Hi, I'm Erhard, and I have a question. The WTO seems to have a lot of legal clout. Would it, if we were to give the WTO more legal, more morality and ethics, would they not be more akin to the UN? Why can't we as citizens go approach the UN and have them figure out a way to increase their legitimacy, just as the WTO has?
I didn't hear the question quite. Is it if the WTO had a morality,
Yeah.
then?
Would they not be more like the UN?
And by morality, you mean if it had human values, not just economic values? Well, no, I think that's a serious, I don't think that's at all a frivolous question. There's one, I'd like to refer to one really positive WTO example. It's one in which Canada, once again, is the bad boy, not the good boy. We, as you know, in Quebec, mine asbestos. We, as you know, as a country, have made the use of asbestos in housing, heating, insulation tiles or sound tiles illegal because you get lung cancer from breathing in the particles. We, as everybody may not know, still export asbestos. And France put a ban on the import of Canadian asbestos tiles. Canada took France to court in Geneva on the grounds that this was a violation of the WTO's trade rules because it was objecting on a non-economic basis to these products. The great surprise is that the WTO ruled in France's favor on the grounds that the French citizenry's concern for their health had to be taken into consideration. So that's an example, I think, in your terms, of the WTO having a moral position. In other words, taking into account other factors than simply economic ones. Have I addressed the point? Yeah.
I would add that even the situation of asbestos is ambiguous, and no matter what the problem is, you can almost always find paradoxes or ambivalences. So one of the major export markets for Canadian chrysotile asbestos is India, where it's used to fabricate very strong but very thin concrete roofing tiles. And these are used as building materials. They're inexpensive, and they make it possible for many, many, many people to build homes for themselves, have shelter over their heads, who would not otherwise have decent shelter. So it's, it may pose a health risk. Certainly, from what I've seen, the health risk of this form of asbestos, particularly when embodied in these roofing sheets, is not the same risk that of the, what we think of as the friable forms of asbestos that we're more familiar with here. But still, certainly it poses a risk. And what would be better, to shut off all trade in that form of asbestos and deny those people of a cheap and reliable construction material, or to allow that to continue? Well, it looks like, shall we draw things to a close by saying once again, thank you very much. Thanks to everyone in the audience. Thank you to CG. Thank you to Jorge for hosting us. And it's been a great pleasure for us. And just a reminder, oh, it looks like there's something going on. This is the bribe portion of the... But just before we stop, just a reminder, there are books available for purchase, and I guess Stephen and I will go over there and be available to sign them. And Stephen, did you want to say anything? Or we also do, okay.
Oh.
Oh.
Explain how it's going to work.
Well, why don't you go ahead?
We're doing a book draw this evening for the Imperial Imbalance.
It's an easy title, I know.
The book is for sale for $34.50. That includes tax. We have copies here, and we'd like to thank Caroline, who came out tonight from our bookstore partner, which is Wordsworth Books in Uptown Waterloo. We have a lot of fans here, Wordsworth fans. So we put everybody's name into this little drum, so if we'd like pick one name out.
I don't think it would be right for us to draw. Should we draw
Who's
the
lucky?
name? Okay.
We can have, why don't we have Joan Eiler stand up? Well, you can pick your own name. Joan is, of course, the president of the local CIC chapter, and thank you very much to the CIC for their co-sponsorship this evening.
And the lucky party is?
Eric Saunders? Aha.
It's
one
a
of our
setup.
question askers.
So this is the copy? No.
No,
The book has been signed, Eric, and it's just up here if you'd like to pick it up. Thank you very much for the donation. Half of our
So
speakers
we
tonight.
signed this. So there you go. Congratulations.
Well, thank you very much. It's been really terrific talking with you, and thanks for your questions and your patience.